I do see monastic life as sacrificial because it's a very intentional way of giving up, focusing one's attention elsewhere, not focusing one's attention on certain things, giving that up to focus one's attention on God. So making certain sacrifices to remove oneself from worldly distractions.
If you know the roots of the Latin roots of that word, sacrifice, it means to make it sacred, make it belong to God. And that is what we, during the monastery, we want to belong to God. We want to make ourselves over to God.
But as time goes by, it seems to me less of a sacrifice. And the vows themselves, I suppose, at some point can stick or can be a problem. But again, as you observe them, it seems to me you experience the liberating quality of them.
Well, for me, I don't see as a monastic life as a sacrificial attitude, but it's kind of supposed to be a joy, because it's a choice, a personal choice that person does to enter, to follow Christ, to be close to Christ for the good of the church and for personal. So I don't see that as a sacrificial.
For me, monastic life as sacrificial is summed up, I think, in the specifically two monastic vows of stability and conversatio morum. Stability, where I vow my life to live here in this community for the rest of my life, and stability that I vow to live it with these brothers whom I haven't chosen and they haven't chosen me, but we're here because we believe God has called us here. And so that means community life. That means learning how to live with one another.
I don't feel like I'm giving up anything, which is really why I feel like this is more of a privilege to be able to do this. I mean, we're sitting here on a Thursday afternoon, you know, whether it's a cybersecurity job, which I used to do, or a 9-to-5 job for anybody else. They're actually having to sit there and work and be there, and I get to sit on the Big Sur coast and do interviews.
Just as parents have to give up some of the things they would rather be doing in order to maintain a home and look after their children, this is a sacrifice. People who are in a marriage give up some of their wishes, some of their desires in order to unite more closely with their spouse. This is a sacrifice. So monastic sacrifice, or sacrifice in religious life, I don't think should be divorced from the common experience of humanity. I think our sacrifices might well be different. Perhaps the three vows, or the three aspects of the vows, show the difference. You know, celibacy and living without an income that you determine and what you spend it on, and etc. And also obedience, listening and following what you hear. These are the three elements of monastic sacrifice, but they're not, by their nature, different to sacrifices other people make.
So every important choice in your life implies something that you are leaving behind. But I think that probably that's not the right way in which we should consider our life. So not just focusing on what we left behind, but what is in front of us, so where we are walking to. And of course our life is a sort of offering to God, to God's church, to our brothers and sisters.
And in the monastic life, I think it's best characterized at the time in the vow ceremony, when the monk either says or sings what's known as the Suscipe. It's, the English goes like this: "Receive me, O Lord, as you have promised, and I shall live. Do not disappoint me in my hope." So at that point, with hands raised, I offered myself, hopefully as a pleasing sacrifice, as they say so frequently in Scripture. Maybe not so pleasing at the beginning, but maybe a little more pleasing as life goes on. So it's an offering of self for transformation, transfiguration.
I think of it in biblical terms in the sense that sacrifice is not the way modern Westerners think of sacrifice, but it's a way of rendering the sacrifice of praise, I call it, which dulls that whole idea of blood sacrifices and so forth, of the ancient world. And God only asks of that, and I think that's one of the driving invitations that comes to the Rule of Benedict.
I was taught by a student of Kilmartin, so I would get a lot of Kilmartin's understanding of sacrifice connected to the Eucharist, which is not just the self-donation of Christ, which is an important part of it, but the sense that the sacrifice is a sacrifice of praise, and that it's a sacrifice of praise to the Father in the Spirit. And so that the sacrifice is Trinitarian and not just Christological, not just Christ's self-donation, although that's not excluded from that.
It occurs to me that the only thing we ever put on the altar besides the bread and wine is the book in which we write our vows. And very much like the bread and wine, not just that book, but we ourselves get lifted up. And just like the bread and wine, which are symbols of our life, we get accepted. And then we get transformed. And again, just like the Eucharist, we get the bread given back to us. We get the wine given back to us, consecrated. And we get our lives back too, transformed by God in some way. But then there's actually another step too, just like the bread gets broken and passed out and the wine gets poured out so that we become Eucharist.
Well, I feel that a sacrificial aspect may be the ego. Try to find a space in our ego that is not according sort of gravitational force around ourself, but to create a certain freedom for others, for wonder, for relationship.
Where we go wrong in monastic life is not really so much, doesn't have so much to do with the ego as it does to do with the meum, the mine, and the clinging to something being mine that prevents monastic life from being fully sacrificial in the meaning that I understand it in as self-gift. And so I hope that, it's a lifelong process, but I hope that my last breath is the last thing that I have to offer. And at that point I can say that, yes, I gave myself completely, everything I have to God and to the community and to the world.